Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around, I'm coming to you from my office because I want to challenge a statement that I hear all the time. I'm sure you've heard it too, and that is simply this. I don't need to worry about high ISO because I have noise reduction software. This implies that a high ISO image after noise reduction software, usually the AI type of noise reduction software, is going to look just as good as a shot at lower ISO. But is that actually true? And if it's not true, how much of a hit are you actually going to take when you shoot a higher ISO and then use noise reduction versus just shooting at a lower ISO to begin with? That's what this video is going to answer, and we're going to look at it in depth here in just a little bit. But first, I want to tell you what else is in this video. So first, we're going to look at those comparisons. Then we're going to compare three different types of noise reduction software. The first is going to be Lightroom, and then we're going to have DxO Pure Raw, which is a real good one. I like that one. And then we also have Topaz Photo AI, and I'm using the most current version of all this software for all these comparisons that we're looking at here today. But before we get into that, I can almost feel the rage comments coming on in the comment section here on YouTube. People are going to get mad. They're going to say, look, sometimes you absolutely have to use high ISO. We don't have any choice. And I agree with that. I'm a wildlife photographer, guys. I get it. Sometimes you got to use that higher ISO, and that's fine. And I'm going to drop tips throughout this entire video. I'm sprinkling them in so that when you're out in the field, you can use those techniques to get a better result in the field. So when you come back to DeNoise, you get the best possible result. So make sure you watch this video till the end. So yeah, I agree 100%. Sometimes you got to use higher ISOs. I mean, sometimes you can use a tripod and a monopod and get a lower ISO, but a lot of times we are stuck with the higher ones. And I've been saying something for probably a decade now, and that is simply this. I would rather have a noisy, sharp, detailed image than a blurry, clean image. Clean meaning, low ISO. Because I can usually fix something that's sharp and noisy, but if it's soft and out of focus, not so much. My chances are much better with the noisy, sharp image. So yeah, if you need to use higher ISOs, absolutely go for it, but just keep it as low as you possibly can. So, if 1,000th of a second is enough to get your shot, don't shoot at 2,000th of a second when that light's really low and it's cranking up your ISO, stuff like that, common sense stuff. So let's go ahead and take a look at the computer here. I'm going to show you this image here that we're working with. So here's our subject. We have a great blue heron, and I was fortunate enough to find one that was more or less stationary and still, although I did have to try 3 times before I could get the series of shots I needed with all more or less the same pose. Still though, we have them. We have ISOs from 500 in one-stop increments all the way to 16,000, giving us 6 different ISO samples to look at that are a stop apart. And the big thing here is that I wanted to give you guys a realistic scenario here. So this was shot in relatively low light and it was getting dark, and I wanted to do that because what happens is as the light gets lower, your ISO is going to look worse at any given value. A lot of people kind of think of ISO as kind of a fixed value of noise, a fixed amount of noise that they're going to have in their photo, but that's not how it works. The darker it is, the worse the ISO is going to look at any given value. So I wanted to make sure that the images kind of reflected that. So this was in very, very low light. And the lowest one here is ISO 500. And I know I'm going to get a little static about that. People are like, why not base ISO? Well, base ISO would have put me, like 1/10 of a second or so. So I didn't want to do that. This is at 1/80th of a second. So from a practical standpoint, I kind of needed to do it this way. And the other thing is that I think realistically, if we are in a low light scenario, we're going to be in a situation where it's going to be hard to get anything lower than ISO 500 anyway. Plus, this was with a Z9 and the secondary gain kicks in on the sensor at ISO 500. So really the ISO 500 on this camera looks about the same as like ISO 250 on this camera. So it is really good. The other thing I want to mention here is we're going to look at 3 different noise reduction software packages. We're going to look at Lightroom, DxO, and Topaz. And the reason for that is simple. I feel like if I don't include all of the more common ones, those 3 common ones, that no matter what I do here, people are going to go into the comments and say things like, hey, you should have tried it with this, or you should have tried it with that. I figure with these 3 popular ones, you guys can see that, yeah, we can see some commonalities between them. And also in the comments, let me know what your preferred noise reduction software is too. That'd be interesting, not just for me, but anyone reading the comments. So let's take a quick look at what these look like at these various ISOs. We're going to jump into 200% here because I'm using a very high resolution monitor. I think it works a little bit better. But I want you to notice, especially on these higher ISO shots, how this noise is starting to overwhelm our detail here. It's kind of eating it up here because that's going to be very important here in a minute. So here's 16,000, pretty darn noisy. And something else I want you to notice here is look at the color here with his eye. this yellow. As I go to 8,000, if you notice, that color got better. And as I go down another notch, the color gets even better. So one of the things with higher ISOs that people kind of don't think about or don't realize is that you lose color fidelity with those higher ISOs. So I think there's some value in shooting lower ISOs just to retain a little bit of color fidelity there. There's one of those field tips I was telling you about. So anyhow, here's our ISO 16, and then we go to ISO 8000. Still pretty darn noisy at ISO 8000. I feel like 8,000 is probably one of those upper limits for most people. In fact, when you're done watching this video, let me know in the comments what your ISO limit is personally. It's just, I'm always curious about stuff like that. I appreciate it. Thanks. Going down, we're here at ISO 4000. You can see it's getting better in here. We're starting to see a little bit more detail showing through here. Here's what ISO 2000 looks like. ISO 1000 looks pretty darn good. And here is ISO 500. That looks pretty clean, especially considering how dark it was that evening. So that is our baseline. Now, one thing I do want to mention to you is that I did noise reduction across the board on every single shot, even the ISO 500 one, because even at those lower ISOs, sometimes we can get a little cleaner shot and we can get a little more detail by doing that, by using our noise reduction software on those lower ISO shots. So if we're giving the advantage to the higher ISO shots, we should give it to the lower ones for a fair comparison. So I'm going to also share my workflow real quick here with you, because a lot of times people are wondering how I do this. I'm using DxO Pure Raw, Lightroom, and Topaz, and I'm using them in that order. Most of the time I prefer Lightroom. In fact, I have a Lightroom tutorial on noise reduction. I will link in the description area below so you can take a look at that. It's a masterclass on doing it. It's about a 45-minute video, but I promise you it's worth the time. That is still my preferred method. However, most of the time when I'm using Lightroom, I start with DxO because it's very fast. You know, less than a minute, boom, I can take a look at it. If I like the result, I'm done. If I don't like the result, then I go into Lightroom or Topaz. And that's the other thing that I think is important, is that different noise reduction software is going to work better on some images than other images. So maybe this image looks better with DxO, and maybe another image later that evening looks better with Lightroom, and maybe another one looks better with Topaz. So it all depends on your image. So that's why it's not a bad idea to have more than one type of software on your computer so that you have several different ones to choose from when it comes to noise reduction, because sometimes some subjects look better with different noise reduction software. So let's go ahead and take a look at our comparisons here. And we're going to start with, let's just start with Lightroom here. I think that's a good way to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use ISO 500 as my baseline for our comparison here. And that's going to be on the left throughout this video. And then we're going to start all the way over here at ISO 16,000 and compare these back and forth. I'm going to try to go through these a little bit rapidly because we have 3 different denoise programs to look at. The first one here, again, is Lightroom. And I use the same method that I described in that video that I linked and I was mentioning a moment ago to do the denoise here. So this isn't just Lightroom denoise. This is my method using Lightroom denoise. And in this particular case, I don't think that this method is the best one for this image. And that's what we were talking about a moment ago. But either way, you can see that ISO 16,000, again, 16,000, it was, you saw that. It was very, very noisy. And you can see that we've lost some detail in here. As you're looking at the feathers and things like that, they're just pretty much gone over here. We've lost a lot of detail. We don't have any of the fine detail up here. You know, for Instagram, maybe this is fine. For Facebook, this is fine. But I think that overall, to me, this is too much of a detail loss. Next, we have the ISO 8000 shot. And you can see we're starting to get a little bit more detail, a little bit more fine detail in here. That one stop made a difference. We see a lot more detail in the neck than we did before. And the beak is looking really, really good. The area around the eyes looking very detailed. Again, it's these feathers in here where we're struggling. This area here, if you look, this is a good spot to be watching as we're going through all of these, because there's some very fine feather detail, as you can see in here, that's just basically still gone over here. The noise just ate it right up. Going down to 4,000, we're starting to get into the range where I think that this is probably becoming a usable photo for me. And part of this too, I want to mention this too, is how picky are you? For me, I am super picky. I'm a pixel peeper. I admit it. I don't care what people think of me. I want to see that detail. I bought a very expensive camera and a very expensive lens. I want to see the detail. So for me, this detail is important, and I'm going to be very particular about it because I'm maybe selling this to a magazine down the road, or maybe someone's going to request a giant print for their wall of something. Probably not this particular shot, but you get the idea. So I want that detail. So for me, This is just starting to get in the realm of usability, this one here at ISO 4000, whereas other people might be completely happy with the one at ISO 16000. So it all depends on how picky you are about this stuff too. So, but again, we're starting to see a little bit of feather detail coming in here that we didn't have on the other shots. Let's go down to ISO 2000, and probably to nobody's surprise, this is starting to look pretty good here. And I really like the Lightroom version of this one. I think probably better than the other two. You'll see those in a second. But as you can see, we're getting some nice detail here in the feathers. We have nice detail in the beak. We have nice detail in the neck. Everything's looking good. And it's very accurate as far as it's not trying to make up information that's not there or anything like that. And then if we go to ISO 1000, I mean, they're almost indistinguishable to me. These are very, very close. There's not much of a difference. I could probably sharpen this one up a little tiny bit more, this one on the right, and we can get even a little bit more detail out of there. But for the most part, these are pretty darn close. So for me, at least with this particular shot with Lightroom, I feel like I could have gone maybe 2 to 3 stops. Once I get into ISO 8000 and ISO 16000, it was just, I was losing too much detail. So let's go ahead and look at DxO. Okay, so once again, we have our ISO 5000 shot on the left, and our ISO 16000 is where we're starting again. And here we go with DxO. And as you can see, the ISO 500 shot has a lot of detail, but here's the thing with these AI denoising programs. If you notice what's happened here, I want you to look at his neck. It's basically making up details that aren't really there. It knows that there's supposed to be feathers there, and it's kind of making stuff up that's not really in there, and it doesn't look great to me. And if you look up here in the feathers along the head here, you can see there's a lot of fine detail that we have over here that's just non-existent here. It kind of just made up some lines in here, it looks like to me, so that it kind of looks like feathers. And one of the things I noticed with AI noise reduction in general, especially like Topaz, DxO, and I think some others too, is that you got to watch these feathers because sometimes they get a very stringy look to them. And you also have to be careful that there's not too much over sharpening. Topaz in particular, we'll talk about that in a moment, but it likes to over sharpen a little bit if you're not careful with the defaults. But even DxO here gets a little bit overly sharp at times, and you'll see that. And if we look around the eye here, you can see that it cleaned it up, but we've lost a ton of detail around that orbital ring there. There's just not a lot of detail there compared to what we see at the ISO 500 shot. Same with the beak. We've lost some of the very intricate detail there. If we look at these areas here, these are, again, this is a big spot to watch throughout this video. You can see that we don't have any detail in here, and we have all this fine feather detail here. So you definitely paid a pretty good price for ISO 16000 here versus ISO 500, a much lower ISO there. So we go to 8000, and we're starting to get a little bit better. And again, I feel like it's still kind of trying to make up some detail here that doesn't necessarily completely match with what we have over here. And again, if we look down here on the neck and we look at some of the stuff here, it gets the rough detail, but it's kind of filling in stuff that's not really existing there in other areas of the neck as we go down. So some of this does not, this feather pattern does not really look the same as this. And we saw, we know that this looks the same. This is basically the same bird in the same situation here. This time though at 8000, we're seeing better detail around this orbital ring. The beak's looking better. We are seeing a little bit more information here, even though I think some of it's kind of AI made up stuff in here. Once again, this area here, though, this white area is very, very lacking compared to here. We're not seeing the fine details. So once again, I think you're paying a pretty big price for shooting at ISO 8000 here versus ISO 500. We get down to 4000. It's kind of the same story that we had with the Lightroom Denoise. And we're starting to see some more feather detail in here. This is getting to be acceptable. I think this is, for me, this is probably about where I could live with it. Again, the neck still does not look great to me compared to the ISO 500 shot, so we're still losing some. But again, we're looking at a very zoomed in version of the image. If you were putting this on Facebook or something, I think even if you were printing this, most people would be happy with it. Going down to ISO 2000, and now it's starting to pick up that extra detail in here that we have here, because the noise, what's happening is the noise overwhelms that really fine detail. And when the noise eats up that detail, what happens is the AI software tries to just kind of smooth it over with other rougher detail. And This is the problem with shooting at higher ISOs, is that if you don't have that information, if that noise overwhelms that detail no longer exists. So it's either going to have to be made up by the AI program, or it's going to simply kind of soften out, as you saw with Lightroom. So if we look at this though, I think at ISO 2000, it's looking good. And again, not a big shock that at ISO 1000, it's looking really good. So once again, you know, from ISO 1000, 2000, even 4000, I think this is very usable. Once you get into 8000 though, boy, there is a real big discrepancy between what we see at ISO 500, the detail that was actually present, versus the detail that we're actually getting from our after noise reduction there. I mean, again, if it's this or nothing, I guess this is okay. But, you know, I think it challenges that statement that I don't have to worry about higher ISOs because I have noise reduction software, because you can see that it does indeed make a difference here. Let's take a look at Topaz. Now, Topaz was a little bit tricky for me because I had to actually, it's not an automatic one like DxO, so I had to go in and I had to adjust this the way I would normally adjust it. Topaz has a tendency to want to over sharpen, and it comes on really, really fast. So what I did is I got it just below the point of where I felt like it was too sharp. And if you are using Topaz, it's great software, but you just, when you're doing that sharpening step in Photo AI, make sure you're not over sharpening it, because what it likes to do is it likes to get these little feathers. Like I say, sometimes they get stringy looking, and it really likes to over sharpen them. Some people like that look, and if you do, great. Topaz is very good at making that happen. But for me, I kind of bring the sharpening down a little bit. I know it sacrifices a little bit of detail, but I don't like that crunchy look. So this is, I've done what I thought looked right here. So, and Topaz didn't do any color correction here too. So you can really see the difference at ISO 500 with the colors. Look at the colors at these different ISOs. Look at the eye here and the beak color and the orange here. It is a noticeable difference there in color. But as we look at this, we can see that Topaz is definitely trying to make stuff up that is definitely not there. I think even more so than DxO. You can see the feather pattern on the blue area here is basically different. It's a different feather pattern than what actually existed here at ISO 500. If we scroll down the neck here, you can see that Topaz said, hey, I'm just going to fill this in at this higher ISO one with just some grain that's kind of streaked like feathers, because this does not look anything like this at all. And if we go down here, you can see it's doing the same thing in this area here. It's just kind of giving up and making up stuff is what I think is happening there. If we look in here, once again, this is an area that's just kind of, it's added some noise in here, and it's kind of, or left some noise, and it's kind of just made it look a little bit like there's detail. It's kind of faking detail, but you can see what the real detail looks like. Even in this area here, if we look over here, it's just, the detail is just not even close. Not even close. So 16,000 is a little bit too much, if you ask me. Now we're down to 8,000 again. I think this is the range where people are usually maybe thinking about having their top end. And as you can see here, it's gotten better. We're seeing a little more detail here, not nearly what we're seeing there. This is starting to slowly morph into what it actually looks like. And if we look here, though, we're still seeing that weird grain with the streaky lines here that doesn't really match the actual feather detail that well at all. So once again, you know, I think 8,000 is pushing it, but, you know, and you can see it wants to over sharpen, even though I've, you know, tried to keep that under control here. Going down to ISO 4000, and if we look back side by side here, it's, once again, it's starting to get there. Now we're starting to see our detail coming back in these areas. The neck is starting to actually take on the proper patterning here, even though it's a little bit soft right in through here. And yeah, so 4000 is getting, once again, on that edge of acceptability. Looking at the orbital rings, though, you can see there's still some detail missing here compared to what was actually there. And ISO 2000, once again, we're looking pretty good here. Not a surprise. We're getting our detail back here, and ISO 1000 is looking almost identical. So I think the takeaway from all of three of these is that a stop or two, absolutely fine. Once you start getting to 4,000, 8,000 of a second, in that range, you're definitely starting to take a hit, even with the AI software. So for me anyway, I think the implication of the statement, I don't need to worry about high ISO, I have noise reduction, I don't agree with that at all. And maybe you do. And maybe some of this, I'm sure there's people watching this going, you know what? Up to 16,000 looked fine to me. It was good enough for what I would do. And that's fine. We all have, again, it depends how picky we are. A couple of other notes here, though. one of the critical things you want to do in the field, if you're shooting in low light like this and you're getting into those higher ISOs, you want to fill the frame. The more you fill the frame, the better the chances that you're going to be able to take noise reduction software and make it work. I'm going to zoom out here. And as you can see, this is not, again, a beautiful composition, but this is, to me, kind of a frame-filling shot with a great blue heron. I realize it doesn't look like that on the screen, but this is kind of a frame-filling shot of a great blue heron, simply because if you picture if you think about turning the camera vertically instead of horizontally, that bird would definitely be filling the frame. So we're getting pretty good results because the bird is big enough in the frame. If you're in a situation where the great blue heron or whatever subject you were photographing was farther back, you're going to run into trouble, because what's going to happen is the detail that we're able to work with here, that the noise reduction software is able to work with here, is going to be smaller, and it's going to be more easily overwhelmed by noise. So one key in the field is, if you're shooting higher ISOs, you want to fill the frame as best you can. And you can also take that the other way and say, hey, my subject's a little far away. I better break out a tripod or a monopod or something so I can drop my shutter speed and use a lower ISO, because I know that my noise reduction software is not going to be able to handle it at those higher ISOs. You're going to get a much better result if you drop those ISOs when you have a subject that's far away, if you can. So if you have a subject that's really far away and you have to use a high ISO, a lot of times it's just a lost cause. You're not going to be able to do it. Another advantage here to a lower ISO out there in the field is if you end up in a situation where you have to pull shadows. So if you're in a situation where you're either underexposed or have to pull shadows, the lower the ISO, the better it handles that. So there's a couple of, again, I think there's reasons to break out the tripod sometimes. So next, let's take a quick look at how these compare side by side, say DxO versus Topaz versus Lightroom versus just what it looked like without any noise reduction. Let's do that. So let's start at the top at ISO 16,000. I'm going to leave the original on the left, and then we'll look at the denoised versions on the right. And first off, we have Lightroom, and you can see this looks pretty good. And one thing I've noticed about Lightroom is that it tries to stick with the original detail and not make up too much stuff. So if it doesn't know it's there, it doesn't just kind of randomly stick things in there. And that's one of the reasons I tend to actually favor Lightroom, because sometimes I just don't want the fake detail that I get sometimes with some of the other packages. But the thing is, it depends what that detail looks like. If it's realistic, yeah, I'll live with it. I'll take it. But a lot of times that's why I end up using Lightroom, because it doesn't feel like there's, a bunch of fake stuff in the photo. But as you can see, it definitely was struggling with this one. It did a pretty good job. I mean, it's kind of a miracle what it can do here, really. But if we look at like areas like this, you can see like this section here where there's just not much information here on the neck. You can see that very little of that information was translated through here, because the noise basically overwhelmed the detail in that area. But overall, Lightroom did a pretty decent job. Let's take a look at DxO. Now DxO, again, I think is making up information here. We have a little bit more of the stringy feather look up here, but we do have a little more detail. And between DxO and Lightroom, I kind of lean just a little bit towards DxO, just because the detail doesn't look so fake to me that I feel like, oh, this isn't going to work. And I'd rather have maybe a little bit more detail there than what Lightroom's pulling out, but it's very close for me, because again, I have a weird aversion to some of that stuff. But again, I think DxO did a pretty good job here, especially considering what it had to work with. But again, I think it's making up stuff in here because there's just not a lot of information right there. But it's kind of just extrapolating what it thinks is supposed to be there. And I think it looks pretty good. Here's Topaz. And Topaz, once again, I feel like is definitely trying to make stuff up here. Again, we talked about this earlier, where it looks like it's just kind of noisy grain in through here that's all kind of pointing in one direction to pretend it's feathers. But again, overall, not too bad. I still think I prefer the other two to Topaz in this case. And I do want to stress that again, in this case, because different images work worse or better with different denoise software. So you have to kind of experiment with it a little bit. So let's take a look at ISO 8000. And we'll go through these a little bit quicker, since you kind of get the idea here. And once again, we can see that we have noise overwhelming areas over here, and Lightroom didn't really try to do too much to fill that in. But again, it just depends. I think Lightroom gives a more realistic look to the image, but in some cases, maybe you want some of that extra detail that the other AI software programs are kind of sticking in there. But overall, I think at 8000, It didn't do too bad considering how it started, but again, knowing what we know at ISO 500, we know that there's a lot more detail to be had here that we just didn't get at ISO 800, but still Lightroom did pretty good. Here's DxO, and as you can see, not too bad. Again, I think it's making up some of the information in here a little bit, but it still looks pretty good. That looks realistic to me. I'm leaning a little bit towards DxO on this one. And again, I feel like this area here is still maybe not, because there's just nothing here to make detail with, so I think it's kind of making stuff up in there a little bit. We go to Topaz, and in this case, I actually like this area a little better on Topaz, but I think I like the DxO area better down here. So again, I lean, again, in this particular case, I still like DxO on this particular shot at this particular ISO. Taking a look at ISO 4000, once again, we have Lightroom on the right starting off here, and I think Lightroom did a pretty good job here. I like the detail I'm seeing around the orbital ring. I like the detail on the beak. The feathers are starting to come in here nicely, and everything looks very realistic to me. Nothing looks, faked in here. So I definitely like I could definitely get by with that one. DxO is looking really good here too. I think that one looks really nice too. I think I probably prefer the Lightroom one just a hair bit more than this one. I don't like kind of what it did to the orbital ring here. I think the Lightroom version was a little bit better, and I can live with the difference in detail in that, because again, these feathers look a little bit stringy to me. I think I'd rather have a little bit softer look like we had. I'm going to pop back to Lightroom, but we don't have nearly as much detail here, so it's kind of a give and take. And here's Topaz. Topaz does a good job here, and maybe Topaz is the best of the bunch here. It's keeping good detail here. It has reasonable detail here without it looking too stringy. So, and this area here looks pretty good too. It doesn't look like there's a lot of made up stuff. So maybe on this one, I kind of prefer Topaz over the other two. And this is, again, every shot's different, every ISO is different as far as which one you're using. Here's our ISO 2000 shot, and in this case, we have Lightroom here once again on the right. I really like Lightroom looks very accurate to me. I feel like I have just the right amount of detail up here and on the neck and everything else. This looks reasonable. This looks like it's not overdone, like it's not over sharpened, and it looks like a proper amount of detail to me. Going to DxO, there is more detail apparent here, and maybe that's okay for some, but to me, this looks a little bit over sharpened in these areas here. So I kind of lean back a little bit more towards the softer Lightroom one right here versus this, simply because I don't like that crunchiness there. I could sharpen that Lightroom one up a little bit more maybe and get something that is maybe somewhere in between there. But, the neck on both of those look good. The beaks look really good. The beak is really nice and sharp on this one too. So I like DxO too. DxO is a very close second. Topaz looks really good here too. I think Topaz did a good job. I think any of these three are probably very usable. For me, I wouldn't hesitate to use any of them at ISO 2000 here. ISO 1000. And I'm really liking this Lightroom one here. You can see nice detail in here. We have nice detail here. Everything looks very realistic with Lightroom. So I do like that one. DxO. I definitely am liking the Lightroom one better. DxO looks like it's still trying to maybe over sharpen some of these areas of feathers up here. And I feel like the Lightroom one looked a little bit more realistic. I'm going to go back to it real quick just so you can see it. It just seems like everything in here looks, I don't know, again, to me it just looks more real than this. This does not look as real to me, but again, some people love this look. And if you do, that's great. It's your photo. I encourage you to go ahead and do that. And here is Topaz. And I think Topaz does a good job in here too. It's not quite as crazy in here, although by default, again, warning for Topaz users, by default, if you just add the sharpening, it really does want to over sharpen this, much sharper than even what we saw here with DxO. So be careful, make sure you dial this in so it looks right to you. But in this case, I think, again, I could go with any of these three. So at ISO 500 here, once again, we have Lightroom right here. And again, one of the things I like about Lightroom is I feel like it looks realistic to me. This is what the feathers actually look like. So I do like the look of that. It looks nice and clean. Going to the DxO version here, I think it's a little over the top here. I think there's too much sharpening going on here. I don't really like what it's doing to the image in these areas right here. So I definitely am preferring the Lightroom version so far. And the Topaz version is probably someplace in the middle there. I think both of them are good, but between this and Lightroom, but I think I like the Lightroom version better. But again, I think this just kind of reinforces our point here that some images respond to some noise reduction software better than others, and even at different ISOs, sometimes one denoise program is better than another one. So So there you have it, but before we go, I want to give you one more field tip. We already talked about making sure you're filling the frame with the animal and to lower your ISO if the animal's really far out. But another critical factor in the field is making sure you have a razor sharp image of the animal. The sharper the animal is, the more detail you capture, the easier it is for noise reduction software to find that detail and bring it back for you. If you have an image that's even a little bit soft, the noise reduction software is going to have a real hard time picking up any of that fine detail, and the noise is going to overwhelm it and it's going to be ruined. So what I do in the field is I will focus on my animal, I will leave AF engaged, and I'll take a little bit longer burst than normal when I'm in this kind of situation, when I'm in a low light, high ISO situation. I'll also, in addition to that, after I get a burst done, I'll defocus my lens. I'll grab the focus ring and I'll defocus it. Then I'll refocus it. And I'll take another burst, and I'll do that several times because sometimes the camera doesn't lock on perfectly, or it's a little in front of or behind the eye. If that's the case, by focusing, shooting, defocusing, shooting again, it gives the camera multiple chances to get on the right spot for your photo. And again, the sharper it is, the better your chances at a good denoising. So hopefully this video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider sharing this with your friends. And if you learned something today, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. I really, really appreciate it. And as always, I hope you have a great day.